Hello, everyone. Welcome to our 10th Office Shop Talk. And I'm, as usual, super excited to have one of my very special friends and colleagues for many, many years, Lisa K. Solomon, join us to talk about citizenship in the office first. And Lisa just came back from South by Southwest. I'm sure we're going to hear a little bit about the exciting things that she did there. Lisa is all about futures thinking, futures positioning, spreading that, because I think, Lisa, both of us believe that it's the way that we can actually help people transition to a better future. Lisa is also a futurist at the D School. She and I crossed paths a number of years ago when she was teaching futures at Singularity. And all of that happened after an illustrious career at Deloitte, where we had also crossed paths. And she wrote an amazing book, which I think is still the standard for facilitators, and it's all about shaping those conversations. So I'm sure, Lisa, you'll share that as well. So today's 10th talk is an exciting one because we've had the opportunity to look and explore in depth with so many of the experts that contributed to the book Office Shock across our 7 spectrums, starting with purpose. We had the chance to speak with Lonnie Brooks, another colleague of ours and good friend, and Lisa was together with Lonnie at South by Southwest. So looking forward to hearing more about that. We had the chance to speak with the Institute for the Future's Executive Director, Marina Gorbis, about the spectrum of outcomes and equitable enterprises, climate impacts. One of our colleagues from the World Resources Institute talking about the circular economy. Ibrahim Jackson, an expert in diversity, inclusion, and belonging on that spectrum of belonging. We had the chance to speak with Jill Parker from BDG Architects about the future of place and time, that office first. And just last week, we spoke with Professor Chuck Allen about agility. And all of that, I'll remind everyone that we had the chance also to meet the Office Shock book bot created by our colleague Jeremy Gershbaum. You can still go out and have a conversation with the Office Shock book bot. It is at officeshock.ai. Now, those 7 spectrums are really creating a new future for work and living, a new future for the office and officing. And what we're going to be speaking today with Lisa about is, what does it actually mean to be in the future of office and the future of officing in what we call the office first? But before I do a quick review of what the office first is, I want to give Lisa the opportunity to say hi, a warm welcome to our 10th Office Shock Talk.
Joseph, thank you so much. Thank you to the Institute for the Future for hosting this. I love being lucky number 10 and really enjoying seeing the participation from around the world, Joseph, which is so exciting to see the energy for what you and Bob and your authors are doing to bring these concepts forward and to really learn together. So I love the whole idea that we're having conversations about the future. As you know, that's my deep passion, because that's how we learn and that's how we build community. So there's nothing better than embodying the values of your work in these kinds of conversations. So I really hope the community is going to chip in with their questions, because that will help us all learn and advance our ideas faster.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It is those questions that are so important to be able to open up new perspectives. With that in mind, I'd love to ask everyone who has joined us on LinkedIn to write in, what are you a citizen of? Since our topic is the citizen of the office first, tell us how you would describe yourself as a citizen of a community, of a country, of a social group, a social network, of friends, however you define yourself as a citizen, because it's so important for us to be talking about membership as where we work and when we work is completely disrupted. Now, in the book, Office Shock, we have a description, a nice graphic description. I'm going to put it up. I'd like to put it up, just a quick walkthrough. When we use the word Officeverse, what we are talking about is not the metaverse. Let's be really clear. Now, we were inspired by the multiverse, okay? We were inspired by the multiverse, just to set the record straight. The metaverse is one additional place where working and interacting and socializing is happening, similar to the office building. And I've mentioned before, as a former architect, it's wonderful to see how the places where we are working and interacting has changed so much. Because of COVID, the silver lining has been that we've been able to actually work from home. I'm currently at a network space, a co-working space in the middle of Switzerland. And we are probably spending more time than not in digital workspaces like Teams. And that is another space where we're working. So we could easily add the metaverse or virtual reality here. I think we could also add anything related to how technology and AI is actually creating spaces. I'm actually, to be honest, spending a lot of time in the ChatGPT window. That's a little bit different than a digital workspace, because the conversations that at least I'm having with GPT-4 now are a really interesting way of officing. So all of that to say, our notion of the Officeverse, inspired by the multiverse, that we're all in our different places, we all have different stories to tell. And that's why the question of how do we identify ourselves as citizens in the Officeverse is really important for us to explore, to ask, to question. And that's why I'm so excited that we have Lisa with us today to be able to share her thoughts on citizenship in the Officeverse. We're going to also hear some insights on citizenship in the real world as well, because that's a space that, Lisa, you're so involved in. So looking forward to learnings there and seeing where we might bring that into this question about how are we citizens, or how might we become citizens in an Officeverse. So, Lisa, I'm going to open over to you, and if we can, there we go. And I would say my first question is, when you read the book and you heard about this notion of an Officeverse, what was your initial reaction?
Well, first of all, I want to congratulate you on the book. I think it's a tremendous piece of work, and I really appreciate how you've brought in your different practices around design, futures, and care for our community going forward. And when I think about even that visual that you just posted, Joseph, I think the citizenship lives between them, right? Those what might feel like beautiful color graphics of the lines, but it's really the glue, the social contracts, the care we have for each other, the norms, and the intentionality that we bring when we think of ourselves as a citizen of something else. And I also want to say, I love your opening question. That alone could have been the showstopper. That I was thinking, I was like, wow, like how often do we pause and we say, what are we a citizen of? What do we belong to? What do we care about? And I think that's getting increasingly important for us to pause and ask ourselves those questions in an increasingly fragmented world. If we think about what technology has done for us, right? And that combined with what's been happening in the world over the last few years, of course, around the pandemic, which has put us literally in physical isolation, which has then disrupted how we work and live, which is, I think, what your book is all about, is to pause and be more intentional about it, not have it happen to us. But to really talk about what we care about so that we can put time and investment in the things that matter most, not just what the technology tees up for us to care about. We really need to pause and ask ourselves, like, what does it mean to be a citizen of the relationships and of the organizations that we are part of our communities? And how do we designed for that, right? And as leaders, how do we organize for that? With so many more options, again, as the office first teed up for us, right? To identify and to put a vocabulary and tangibility about what this really means. What does it really mean to live and work in the future? So I think you've done all of us a huge service by outlining that, by naming it, by providing those, mixers about the kinds of choices we can make, so that fundamentally we feel like we have more agency and shaping the ways in which we want to put our talents and passions to work on behalf of the things we care about. Again, these are all choices. And Joseph, this is what I spend every day doing, is waking up and saying, how can I bring ideas forward that allow my students, the leaders that I work with, to think more productively, more positively, more expansively about the range of choices that they have for themselves, and how they tee up the kinds of relationships and organizations to allow others to do that as well.
So I would love to hear about your stories from this week from South by Southwest, because I know you and Lonnie and many others had the opportunity to actually put that into practice. And I think it would be worthwhile for us to understand how, going into that environment, given all of the challenges, not just in Texas, but I think across the country, how did those challenges seep into the kinds of interactions and ways that you're so good at triggering enthusiasm and triggering agency to be able to shape the future?
Thank you for that question. And if you'll allow me, as you know, any great present moment, which is now a past moment, happened, and was planted way before. So if you allow me just a couple minutes to give the origin story of how did this incredible community come together to create, in essence, what was a 3-day party about the future. We called it the Futures Cantina. Loosely inspired, of course, by Star Wars and the great, Return of the Jedi, that great scene where they walk into the bar with all these different talents and folks from everywhere. We wanted to really expand the community of practice of futurists, of artists, of actors, of writers to come together, researchers, and really offer a window, a portal, if you will, into how many futures might unfold around our agency in shaping those futures. And specifically, we were part of the EDU experience before. We were all very much grounded, and to use one of your great words and Bob's great words, we had clarity about who we were serving. And we were really serving educators who were, of course, touching our next gen. But let me back up a little bit and say, how did this even come about? Well, you can imagine in 2020, March of 2020, I had been working as a designer and futurist in residence at the Stanford D School for a couple of years. Pandemic hits, and all of a sudden, they're like, as you know, as I'm sure that in our fellow futures practitioners, we got very popular at about mid-March 2020. Like, help us understand this thing called a pandemic that was supposed to only be 2 weeks, a shutdown of 2 weeks, seems to be longer, huge amounts of uncertainty in the air. How do we respond? We want to move past the fear and paralysis. What can we do? I ran an internal scenario planning practice. And as you pointed out in my intro, I've had many, many years of doing that with my roots back at Global Business Network that started over almost 20 years ago at this point. And realized that, of course, while we can't predict the future, we can socialize and we can become more attuned to the driving forces that might then tee up a variety of futures. And that would help lead to some more robust moves that we can make, even though we were all feeling very, very overwhelmed by the complexity and the novelty of the situation. So I am very lucky at the D School. Not only do I get to teach classes like Inventing the Future, which I'd love to talk a little bit about. Today is our last class. But we have a wonderful part of our community that has been dedicated for over 10 years of working with schools, K-12. So we have a K-12 lab. And my colleagues at the K-12 lab were part of this internal scenario planning process and said, oh my gosh, every school in the world is asking themselves questions about what's going to happen in the fall, right? We're gonna do what we can to get through this year. It was the spring. There were only a few months left. That was a hugely disruptive moment, but it was really looking ahead towards the fall, saying, wait a minute, we still have so much uncertainty about what might unfold. Is it going to be hybrid? Is it going to be remote? How do we know? So we started to run these future sprints for school educators and leaders around the world, almost overnight. And they were hugely valuable for the hundreds of educators that we invented this, Joseph, I mean, the gift of design and futures is that you can have that agility that you were talking about. You can put things in the world and learn along the way. And so I had the opportunity to really introduce futures thinking in that context, not only to my colleagues to understand, wait a minute, this is a teachable and learnable discipline that can help leaders organize environments and systems, that can help educators think about how they're going to take what is available to them to create meaningful learning experiences. And that really set us off on a journey. So for the last 2.5 years or so, we have been working, my colleagues at the K-12 Lab and our extended community, like Lonnie Brooks, to think about how do we make these futures practices more available to younger people, which to me, Joseph, is really one of the most important things we can do. If we think about literally our future, of course, it's our young people. They will not stay young. And if we think about how many of us who are in the futures world almost got accidentally introduced to it, it is almost a crime that we are not taking these practices and bringing them to our young people in more institutionalized, integrated, connected way. And by institutionalized, I just mean that it's part of the curriculum. I don't mean that it's any one way. So this to me was thrilling, right? On the flip side of any great challenge is opportunity. And the work has been tremendous. And so we, again, been taking inspiration from the outside in, huge inspiration to us, of course, the work that you're doing, and the great work of Roman Krznaric, the good ancestor. And we said to ourselves, oh my gosh, how do we think about teachers as ancestors, right? Because they are teaching the descendants of the future. So last year at South by, we took inspiration from Roman and some of the growing practitioners, like Lonnie, like Ahmed Best, like Meredith Hutchinson and Aisha Bain from Resistance Communication. And we created a Futures Museum. So this is 2022 at South by, where we had educators imagine portraits of their descendants. So essentially 100 years-ish in the future. And we had an analog experience to bring that to life. Because as we know, futures thinking, part of the challenge is it can be very abstract. So we made it as concrete as possible. Do I have any here? I'm looking. And we turned these around and we created a beautiful museum. So it was a futures museum. That was like magic. And the thing that was amazing about that experience was the feeling in the room and the connectivity. We had educators literally having conversations with their fourth generation descendants and a time capsule. And so that got us more excited to continue this work. And this year we expanded even further. We had a dedicated space. As I mentioned, we called it the Futures Cantina. We brought in even more futures practitioners, brought in Ruth Wiley, for example, from Arizona State University's Center for Science and Imagination, brought in my colleague, Jeffrey Rogers, who works at Be Radical and does a lot of futures facilitation work. We did a whole session on imagining images of the future. And essentially we created a space where first and foremost, getting back to citizenship, people felt welcome. It was the most vibrant, energizing, welcoming space throughout the entire South by. And everyone said, this is where I want to be. And then around the room, we had touch points to learn some of these futures approaches that we've been developing at the D School. So for example, tracing change over time. Turns out those are teachable and learnable skills. Or building empathy for the future is a huge part of our work. And we had opportunities for educators to kind of self-select, to dip in. We had a metaverse that we worked with our great partners down in Southern California, Vadim, just to introduce, to lower the barrier of anxiety about what this means to teach for the future. And then we had workshops throughout the time as well, like with Ruth and Jeff that I mentioned. Happy to share more. The culmination, I know you're giving me a lot of airtime here, but the culmination that we could have never imagined with our 20 plus community of futurists and practitioners and educators bring this together. We had a party for the future. And our colleagues Meredith and Aisha created a hope tree made out of garbage cans and like wired. And we had all these educators put their hopes for the future. Standing room only. Like we had 5 fire marshals we had to manage. And the surprise of the evening was the U.S. Secretary of Education, Miguel Cardona, came by, right? We could not have planned for this, and took in everything that was feeling, this feeling of connection, a feeling of belonging to the future, caring for each other. And he gave a 1-minute sort of enthusiastic validation of everything that we were doing. And for us, it was like magic. Here we have the highest elected or appointed official who's overseeing education, right? Like hundreds of millions of students saying, I'm going to take this feeling, I'm going to take these hopes, I'm going to bring it to President Biden. We're going to launch our budget tomorrow. And I think for all of us, it was this magical validation moment of what's possible when you have clarity about the kind of connections, relationship, learning, discovery orientation that you want to create in a space, and you allow people to grow and learn with it, right? We're not imposing anything on it. So that was a big overview, as you can tell. Feeling it, we're still I appreciate it and I encourage people to check out the schedule that I just saw Julie put in the chat, because it's something. And any one of these fabulous practitioners that we brought together in community is worth knowing, is worth learning about. And I'm happy to follow up with anyone that wants to learn more.
So I'd be very curious to hear, Lisa, in that space that you were able to create that sense of inspiration, to be able to imagine, to have that feeling of connectivity. I love what you said about having clarity of purpose, of clarity of the interconnections, and that clarity being very revealing on where can you actually amplify the agency, because it sounds like that's what you were aiming for.
Big time.
I'm curious, what would you say were the 2 or 3 characteristics of citizenship in that community?
Yeah. Oh, it's a great question, Joseph. I'm not sure I've thought about it quite in that way. I want to give a huge shout out to my colleague, Laura McBain, who is one of the co-managers of the D School and has been a co-director of the K-12 lab, along with Sam Seidel, both of them, because they set the tone. And I want to say that citizenship is, I think, inextricably linked with leadership. Because when you have clarity about the values and the intentionality of the kind of culture you want to bring, even if it's temporary like this, it's everything. It is everything. And so I think building off of our success and what we felt the year before, where we really felt like family. And, before working on this together, people didn't even know each other. They were strangers. But Laura and Sam really extended a lot of the values that we have at the D School around trust, transparency, clarity, right? Clarity that this is going to be a welcoming space, that this is going to be a space where we say yes and. Doesn't mean we don't critique, but we're going to build, we're going to honor, we're going to experiment to learn. We're not going to blame anyone if an idea that we thought would happen didn't. We're going to reflect on it. We're going to open up every meeting with a check-in, a personal check-in. We even had someone who was dedicated to, we called it D-Care. They were the D-Care person. Are you fed? Do you need a break? Are you, these things are really overwhelming.
Right.
And so the more that people felt seen in this environment, the more they could be themselves, the more energy they brought to it. And it was electric in that way. And so I think then and believe me, we had a lot of educators come in there and they're like, what is this thing? Is this a party? Is it a dance? Is this a restaurant? Is it a cantina? What is this thing? But they were overwhelmed by the sense of joy and possibility in the room that they stayed. And then they told others. And so again, while we didn't have certainty, right? We know like the future will reward clarity and will punish certainty. Thanks to Bob for naming that. I think about that all the time.
Yes.
And I think the book does a great job of saying, okay, well, how do you get to the next level of that? I think that we had great clarity about what we wanted it to feel like. And as you know, Joseph, because you and I are total design nerds and geeks, that's what design is about. Design is about making choices that allow others to get value from whatever choices they are. So whether it's designing something like this or designing an experience, it's paying attention to those details and the congruency of those details and how they add up to then deliver the opportunity for people to feel and learn and be a part of something bigger than themselves. And
Right,
so,
right.
it was all of those attention to detail that I think allowed people to feel like they were part of something bigger.
And I love the hand movement there, Lisa. I saw the hope tree that you described
Yes.
as you made that movement, and I think the hope tree kind of manifests that. It was that what Bob refers to in the book as the enchanted object, less from a technological perspective, but more from a social technology perspective.
Yes.
And those
Yes.
connections happened through that hope tree. And there was another aspect I thought was very interesting. And we know, as we design places and try to create meaning in places, you have to have those artifacts, those things that people are able to identify with. And there's nothing more powerful than having an artifact that has been co-created, that everyone can look at it and either see something that they've done or see the effort that they've put in, and the result is in front of them. That's a very, very powerful feeling, connecting really with the social technology that binds a community like that together.
Yes. And I think that everyone walked away going, wow, how do I create my own kind of environment that felt like this? And again, it wasn't fancy. I mean, there was some costs involved, but not, it wasn't, we didn't architect it through technology. As you said, we architected through relationships. And I think, I've had this practice for a long time, a personal practice, particularly when I bring in and start a new relationship where someone that I want to learn from and work with. And I say, what's the best phone call you can get from me? Like, I want to tee up an experience where you're always going to want to take my phone call, because whatever the last exchange you had with me was joyful, delivered value, created something that we were able to build together. And in some ways, that's my own form, bringing in one of your terms, Joseph, of future back, right? That's my personal form of future back. Like, let's imagine, right? We've done something. What's the best phone call you can get from me? Like, what do you want to say yes to? And I think that's a really, really powerful practice. And I think that's why this is continuing to grow. And it's up to us to say, okay, let us now scaffold more opportunities, because as you said, it's still very, very abstract. And I think all of the workshops that we had were an attempt to make things more digestible and more concrete. And, just building on this sense of like, how do we know what good looks like? And how do we think about more ways to understand the world that we're in and maybe the delta from where we want to be. I want to maybe just explain a little bit of the workshop that my colleague Jeffrey Rogers and I ran, called Flights and Futures, Building Stories for Tomorrow. And it was really taking some of the original concepts in futures thinking, Fred Pollock and others, around the image of the future, right? And I think it's relevant here when we talk about like images of citizenship and what does that mean? And we use popular culture and movies. We actually literally created a card deck. I have one here. Here's a Flights and Futures, inspired again by many of our colleagues, Stuart Candy, Dunnigan, among others, that use cards and modalities, again, concreteness. And we said, what are these images of the future, and what do they suggest about the kind of societies that they're a part of? So whether it was, Blade Runner or Hunger Games, or even the World Economic Forum, as an example, we had these images. And then we had question cards, which got people to really, dive into like, who wins and who loses in this future? What are the sources of power in this future? How do you understand how this future came to be? All of it to kind of get at some of these questions around, what does it mean to be a part of the society? What would it mean to reshape it? And to become, at the very least, better consumers of the futures that are around us. And then ideally better reconstructors of different futures, because then the second part was to say, okay, take elements of this society and then recombine it with a different system, and how would you bring about a different future to life? So again, I'm getting into some technical weeds here, but I think all of it was a way of saying, wait a minute, there's opportunities for us to question and learn everywhere, to say, wait a minute, is this the future track we want to be a part of? And if not, how do we change it?
And what you described, I think, is so much about design conversations,
Yes.
being able to put out ideas, be inspired by film or other cultural icons, and to be able to have those conversations in a co-creative way so that we're able to really co-create the future together. I would love to hear, what are some of the tools that you're using now to engage the next generation of voters,
Yeah.
the next generation of citizens? How are you engaging them to manifest their citizenship in a very, as Bob refers to, VUCA world?
Yes. Well, yeah, it turns out I've become an accidental citizen designer of sorts, an advocate. And again, I'll just give you a brief history of how we got here, to now some efforts that are touching tens of thousands of young people and helping them become more empowered, more confident, more capable citizens, not just voters. And it really stemmed from, I think, one of the gifts of being a designer is to say, like, what's happening here? Is the status quo working? And if not, can we ask some why questions and reframe and perhaps do some experimentation about a new approach? And this started for me, this kind of passion project that's somewhat overtaken my life, trying to, save democracy, whatever, no biggie. In 2019, at the D School, we have the opportunity to really imagine different kinds of learning experiences for our students. We're given a lot of creative freedom, which so appreciate, for us to push the boundaries of our own practice. And if we all go back to the Wayback Machine, 2020 was looking like it was going to be a very tricky presidential election here in the US. I know we have a lot of international folks. And my very first job, Joseph, very first job out of college was working on a political campaign in this super Wayback Machine. So I had a little bit of personal experience. That was decades ago. And as a futurist, I said, was there anything broken about that system that has now changed? Or if we look even to 2016 and we think about the macro dynamics in play that set such a divisive election back in 2016, have any of them been fixed? Like, could we imagine less money, or less misinformation, or less echo chambers? And of course, no, it's only been amplified, and technology's only made it worse. So I wanted to experiment with a different way of engaging young voters, because it felt like we were on a pattern. Again, thinking about our young voters are going to grow up and be not so young voters, and knowing that these are the foundational years that we shape concepts of what does it mean to actually participate in a self-governing society, in a democracy. And the pattern here in the US, totally simplified, is that we raise tons of money, billions of dollars. I think the last election was $14 billion that goes towards nothing other than that moment in time, and paying all the consultants. We raise all this money and we yell at young people or shame them into voting. That's basically the pattern. And the closer it gets, the more expensive the ads and the fancier the people are that are yelling at young people. We don't actually empower them. We don't actually teach them. We don't ask them to think like voters. So I created a new class called Designing the President. And the whole idea was, what if we reframed how we engage young people in thinking like hiring managers? And it morphed to be Vote by Design. So Julie, maybe you can look at votebydesign.org and stick that in the chat, because what happened is that this reframe of helping young people feel like they already had agency, right? Like, imagine reframing and say, look, at age 18, you become a hiring manager of the most important job in the country. You get to hire the president with your vote. Voting is just a mechanism, but that's essentially what it is. Mm-hmm. And then we said, well, what is this job, right? Like, what's the job description and what makes someone good at that job? So instead of saying like, hey, are you a Trump person or a Bernie person? We said, what matters? Do you want someone empathetic? Do you want someone charismatic? Do you want a good communicator? And it allowed young people to get into a totally different conversation that they felt able to have. That was the thing, really, like, scripting agency. And then we did a whole bunch of things that again allowed them to practice. They listened to debates. They turned to their sheet. We literally had a sheet turned about the physicality of things, and we said, "Well, wow, you just heard from Kasich, Governor. Like, what was he pitching about himself? Oh, wow, I didn't realize he was pitching. He was really quite religious. That hadn't registered with me. So we're again giving them these little bite-sized moments to feel like they can engage. We had scenarios that we gave them. We said, look. Imagine all the leadership qualities that you care about come true. You need now to make a speech to the American people in response to this crisis. And Joseph, I kid you not, that in the summer 2019, we had a scenario of a global pandemic of a flu-like virus that emanated in China and took down the world economy. I kid you not. We had natural disasters, we had insurgencies, we had hackers. So hats off to my brilliant fellow scenario planners, Nancy Murphy, Bree Lincoln Hoker, that helped me create this. We didn't mean for them to be so accurate. But all of this is in some ways, again, I'll bring in a concept that you all talk about, exposure to voluntary fear, right? We said, like, we put them in a place where they hadn't been before. They got through the other side and they said, wait a minute, I totally have a way of approaching thinking of myself like a voter. Long story, tried to make it a little shorter. When the pandemic hit, we made that, we digitized it. I took it out of the D-School. We turned it into Vote by Design. We made everything available to any educator that was trying to figure out productive ways to get their young people involved in the election, to think like voters, because of course it becomes so partisan that educators were doing the exact opposite thing that we wanted them to do. They were walking back. It used to be presidential elections were amazing years to teach civics. Now they're like, I'm not touching that. So we made it, because it was all nonpartisan, we gave them pathways. We designed pathways for them to get involved. Then what happened was other people started to contact me from other adjacent areas that said, wait a minute, I hear you know how to design materials that help young people get civically engaged, that help them see themselves as voters. I got the most unexpected call from a 6'10" basketball coach down at Georgia Tech at the time in Atlanta. And he called me in June, shortly after the murder of George Floyd and all of the activity and protests were happening. He had a basketball team that was basically paralyzed with all of the emotion that they were feeling. And they were trying to process how they could be more productive in this moment. And in a Zoom call, he had my now partner, Coach Eric Reveneau, a senior, said to his teammates, if you care so much about the future, how many of you registered to vote? And nobody raised their hand. And for Coach Eric Reveneau, who was probably the most important adult in these young people's lives, he could not believe that in 25 years of coaching, he never thought to say, what are you doing to be a good citizen outside of our team? You know how to be a teammate, but how are you showing up for your community? How are you thinking about voting? So he took to the Twitter sphere, the interwebs, a couple of days later and said, listen, on election day, we should not practice or play. We should vote. Hashtag all vote, no play. Right. And a movement was born. 2,000 coaches signed a pledge. That means tens of thousands of athletes now had election day off from voting, from playing in order to vote. But the problem was, Joseph, and this is a big part of, I think, the work you're doing and the work we're trying to do, nobody knew what to do with that because all of the materials were still overwhelming. Nobody had designed experiences to help these people feel like, how do I take what I am good at and be able to translate that to other elements of my society, my community? I want to do the right thing, but I don't know how. I'm overwhelmed. So for the last 18 months, we have been building programs, materials, relationships, partnerships to help student athletes, because they are the epicenter of college campuses. The way they model behavior then becomes like a ripple effect of how others can model behavior. Again, not just voting, but how they show up as good citizens, to be able to use that as bright spots and amplifiers across campus. And it's been wildly successful. And we're just at the beginning of the next chapter. And so, you know, this idea that we can empower influencers on campus that have been often overlooked by other fields, to say, how do you take the things that you do as an athlete, the discipline to get better every day, to care about your team member, to care about how your team shows up on behalf of the pride of the school, to take that as an opportunity to engage fans in productive ways. That is a very exciting pathway to showing up to citizenship and building the kind of communities and societies we want to be a part of.
Well, it's fabulous to hear the clarity on that group of influencers in that target audience, in those places on campus. The clarity there is just astounding, Lisa. And what's so powerful, I think, for all of us is to be able to say, what are the areas that we actually want to amplify citizenship, where we want to augment a connection and that belonging to a community for a greater purpose. And I think in the example of All Vote No Play, you've done an incredible job, particularly in the United States, because of the influence of sports. And I think
that's
that's
the thing.
amazing.
I appreciate that, Joseph. And again, I think it's a lot of what you talk about in the book and your work more generally, which is like, first of all, telling the stories of bright spots. So I know storytelling is a big part. We literally invented this. Like, this did not exist in any way. And we've been inventing it one experiment at a time. And for me, it's the stories of the student athletes, like Ryan Belk, for example, who is a football player at Yale, who was a survivor of the Parkland shootings in Florida 4 years ago. He never thought of himself as political. But he said, oh my gosh, I'm taking inspiration from what my classmates have done around gun safety and marches around the world. And I want to bring that with what I can do. And he created a voter registration drive on his campus, almost surprising himself. Or Elizabeth Ford is the captain of the Penn women's volleyball team, who, recognizes that every time she plays, she has high school students and younger generation volleyball players looking to her for inspiration. She led Penn Leads the Vote on her campus. We got her connected because of the new relationships we built to speak at Vote Early Day in Philadelphia with the mayor. So all of a sudden, this college senior is now speaking with the mayor of Philadelphia. They have mascots from all of the local Philadelphia schools, from Temple, from Villanova. They're celebrating, right? Finding civic joy in a moment when there's so much civic despair. So it's those micro moments that you're scaffolding. And to your point about the clarity, everything we do is positive. We don't go into the critique. Everything we do is about reframing the language of athletics to work towards citizenry and community building. So civic joy, civic tailgating, civic sportsmanship, to try to break down something that felt foreign, to say, no, you're already doing it, catching them doing something good, and just changing the narrative of what's possible.
Well, everything that you've described really raises the big question: how might we find those kinds of micro moments, those rituals, those culturally significant events, those influencers in our office first? As we really do need, I think, particularly at a corporate level, to be able to come together in the ways that you're describing, that you were able to apply futures to bring those young citizens to exercise their power to vote, to bring together educators, to then engage K through 12 students. Those three examples that you've shared with us are really powerful ways to then ask the next question: how might we find some corollaries? What are the analogs in the corporate scene, in this place that we are all working in, that we're calling the office verse, in a way that ideally would increase our citizenship, our corporate citizenship, to take more responsibility for finding a better balance between production and consumption, for addressing some of the economic inequalities from some of the for-profit business models, for finding greater sense of shared purpose. So not just focus on individual owners, and changing the ways that we actually interact with different people, that spectrum of belonging, and all of it being in a very agile way, informed by our passion for design practices.
Yeah. It's a great question. I mean, it's worthy of a whole, much more conversation, much more learning from this community and others. I mean, again, I think it starts with the leaders, and I think it starts with clarity of values, and then that cascades to the incentive systems throughout the organization. and the way that things get honored and celebrated. I mean, it's not through KPIs. I'll tell you that. That doesn't mean that those aren't important and that we don't need ways to measure. But a lot of what I'm talking about, is around the relationships, is around the connections, is around the joy, is around, really feeling purpose in that way, right? In the way that you are showing up. And so I think it starts with us, reflecting and saying, like, what does this be for us? Finding that clarity, not just fancy words in a mission statement or in value statement, but then having clarity about, when did that show up this week? When did that show up today? When did I feel it? How can I pause, notice it, share that with others? And then maybe over time, right, we can start to, find those incentives to really to talk about it in a way that says, wow, this week we're going to talk about the most joyful moment that we had, or this, to really sort of give permission to feel like that they can put some of those human values to work, integrated into, the other ways that we are measuring how businesses function. And to start to kind of think of it, as you said, as an and, right? Not an either or, not a binary. But right now we're so overweighted. And I honestly feel that the technology is going to make it worse when we think about the fact that these devices and all of the ways that we connect are operating as surveillance, mechanisms. Are you really on or not on? Like, what does that communicate in terms of trust, right? Are you really working from home or you're not working from home? Versus saying, like, how can we describe and really honor the kinds of human connections, relationships, values that we want to build and want to grow within our organization. So we have a long way to go, I think, in really finding more concrete ways to identify them, to talk about them, to honor them. And I think it's doable. I think it's doable, but it's not going to come from ChatGPT. It's not going to come from, looking at what the way that our current, P&L exists right now. It's going to come from leaders that really identify what makes a high functioning team, and looking at that and taking some of those attributions seriously, and blending them into their work. And that may feel uncomfortable because they may not know. That may also mean taking some things off of their plate, right? Like, hey, we're going to start with a check-in. We're going to start with human moments. Wait a minute, but I need those precious minutes, to go through the things I needed to go through. Well, is there another way to go through that? Because when you're together, we should be together. So I think there's a lot of room. And, listen, Peter Drucker said famously, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And I think about that a lot, right? And so culture building, and we also know from Stuart Brand and Pace Layers, culture building takes time. It doesn't happen because you created a fancy poster and you talked about all the things that you want the company to do. It happens because people watch the leaders modeling those behaviors. So I think we must take it seriously. These times, as you said, cuckoo times, right? Like they require even more care around the way we show up for each other. And what the good news is that there's opportunities to see what good looks like everywhere if we pause and notice it.
And all of what you just described, Lisa, I think is very much in line. There were two comments in the chat about citizenship as expressing one's humanity. And what you just described, I think, was a very good way of capturing the essence of our humanity, which has been distracted, it has been influenced, it has been obstructed by the categories. One of the commenters talked about the left-right categories. Bob, in his book, Full Spectrum Thinking, before Office Shock, spoke about the importance of being, avoiding those categories, to be able to think full spectrum. That was really the inspiration of the book. And I think if we can come away with, a very simple call for more humanity in the office verse, then I think we have set ourselves out to have an aspirational future. And we certainly need to start thinking about, well, if that is the future where we are expressing our humanity, where we are clearer about the importance of connections and those meaningful moments between people, then we've got some really interesting future back work to identify, well, what's next? And then ideally we'll be more informed to make some of those choices for what now, so that we can be more fulfilled in our citizenship and our role in society, whether it be in the communities that we are a part of, or in the organizations that we work with, or ideally with the people who, as you mentioned earlier, we just enjoy spending time with.
Yeah.
Lisa, I want to thank you so much for bringing the question of citizenship in the office first to life by telling those stories about what's actually happening in these different communities that have to weigh in, they have to exercise their citizenship. And I think it's just a wonderful way for us to be inspired, to think about, well, what might citizenship in the office first be? So I really, really want to thank you for all that. And we'll follow up with a couple of the links that you mentioned. I just want to do a quick shout out. A lot of, Lisa, what you were talking about when we are thinking about things that we make and we embody the future, that is very much at the core. You mentioned our colleague Jake, and Jake is focused on, Jake Dunnigan, he is focused on a great class called Design Futures, which is going to be coming up from IFTF. Next Tuesday, I'll have the opportunity to speak with another very good friend and colleague, Shanti Flynn. She's based in the UK, spent most of her time in Asia in the corporate space. So we're going to talk about change and how Future Back is influencing change in corporate space, but also in Bangladesh. So I'm really excited that we'll have an opportunity to shine a light on how futures and creating a better world might enable us to all move forward in a different way, because we definitely need to mobilize our collective citizenship. With that, again, Lisa, I want to thank you so much, and look forward to seeing everyone join us next week for our next Office Shop Talk. Thank you.
Thanks, Joseph. So fun. So wonderful. Thanks, everyone, for coming.
Indeed, indeed.